to another literary reading in an extraordinary benefits series celebrating Alaska Quarterly Review's 40th anniversary. You can find the recordings of previous programs at our website at aqreview.org and our YouTube channel. Today, we have three outstanding poets that I feel fortunate to share the next hour with. It's also April, finally. It's been a long winter here in Alaska and in most ways for all of us. But there's much to celebrate: the return of the sun and poetry. It's National Poetry Month, which was begun by the Academy of American Poets 25 years ago to remind us that poets have an integral role to play in our culture and that poetry matters. As Poet Laureate of the United States, Joy Harjo says, poetry plays a crucial role in society. Poetry can hold in a very small container sometimes what nothing else can. Poetry can hold grief so immense that there's nothing else that can contain it, and stories that are dense or unspeakable. It can hold joy and awe and all the contradictory parts of ourselves, and as the writers here today have demonstrated, the contradictory parts of our country. Sometimes 3 or 4 little lines can hold a whole lifetime. One way I celebrate National Poetry Month is through AQR contributing editor Jane Hirschfield's Poem a Day in my inbox. Closer to home in Alaska, the daily April poem Broadsides by Alaska poets at 49writers.org. And as always, and this is something you can do too, is order and buy poetry books from your local bookstore. And of course, being here today and supporting Alaska Quarterly Review. Welcome. I'm Heather Lindy, and on behalf of the Center for Narrative and Lyric Arts and our host, the Anchorage Museum at Rasmussen Center, thank you for being here today. Gunas Chish, as we say here on the banks of the Chilkat River in Haines, Alaska, the homelands of the Tlingit, Jilkat Kwan, and Jilkut Kwan since time immemorial. And while this reading is free, like all literary journals, Alaska Quarterly Review could use your help, so please consider a donation. And thank you very much for those of you that already have donated, as we're like this far from our goal of $15,000, and I have a feeling we may go over it today. Now I'd like to introduce Ron Spatz, the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Alaska Quarterly Review, a professor of English at the University of Alaska. Ron is a former National Endowment for the Arts Fellow and the recipient of 2 Alaska Governor's Awards and a Contribution to Literacy Award from the Alaska Center for the Book. Under Ron's 4 decades of leadership and vision, Alaska Quarterly Review has created strong connections between Alaska and the larger literary community in the United States, and today, one of our guests is coming from France, so around the world, really, and has been especially influential in supporting new and emerging writers, as well as presenting works that include a rigorous questioning of larger societal issues. Ron?
Thank you, Heather, and welcome, everyone. The event today is being recorded and will be available on the Alaska Quarterly Review YouTube channel. And before we begin, I need to make a few acknowledgements. Alaska Quarterly Review gratefully acknowledges the Anchorage Museum for hosting and providing technical support for this event, and Web 907 for its web support of Alaska Quarterly Review, and the Center for the Narrative and Lyric Arts, Alaska Quarterly Review's 501c3 umbrella organization, which makes this event possible. I also want to make an official land acknowledgement. Alaska Quarterly Review recognizes the indigenous land on which all Alaskans live. AQR is located in Anchorage, and Anchorage is Dena'ina homeland. Dena'ina is the language spoken by the traditional, present, and future caretakers of this land. Land acknowledgement opens a space with gratefulness and respect for the contributions, innovations, and contemporary perspective of indigenous peoples, and marks our collective movement toward decolonization and equity. Today, as Heather said, we're delighted to have 3 amazing poets for our second National Poetry Month event. We're going to start with Alexandra Teague, Mary Peelen, and Nicky Beer. Joining me today, you met our moderator, Heather Lundy. Heather is the author of 4 books, all published by Algonquin. If you lived here, I'd know your name. Take Good Care of the Garden and the Dogs. Find the Good, which is this year's Alaska Reads book, and her most recently published book of Bears and Ballads. So to begin, I send it over to Heather.
Thank you. It's just my pleasure to introduce our poets today. Alexandra Teague is the author of the poetry collections, or What We'll Call Desire, which the New York Times Book Review noted that she makes her long sentences into exuberant pageants, part sex appeal, part enduring outrage, and by no means devoid of comedy. Also, The Wise and Foolish Builders and Mortal Geography, which was winner of the 2009 Lexi Rudnitsky Prize and the 2010 California Book Award Gold Medal. She also published her first novel, The Principles Behind Flotation, in 2017. She was awarded the 2019 Civitella Ranieri Foundation Fellowship and was previously the recipient of the 2014 Missouri Review Jeffrey E. Smith Editor's Prize, a 2011 National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, and a 2006-2008 Stegner Fellowship at Stanford. She's currently an associate professor out in the Palouse in the University of Idaho's MFA program and faculty advisor for Fugue and an editor for the Broadsided Press. She's also visited all 50 states and has hiked 220 miles of the John Muir Trail and prides herself on having a strong sense of humor. Of the poetry anthology that she edited, Bullets into Bells, Poets and Citizens Respond to Gun Violence, Plowshare said, quote, instead of romanticizing suffering, particularly a kind that disproportionately affects marginalized groups, the book's contributors work to untangle and communicate what Colin McCann describes in his introduction as the intricate nuances of suffering. Alexandra Teague, who says, you would think that being a poet, I would be good at concision. In reality, a one-page poem usually takes me about 14 pages of drafting. Not all different words, but recombinations of words and countless images and metaphors and ideas that never appear in the final version. Mary Peelen is a poet and writer who lives in San Francisco and Paris. Her fiction and nonfiction and poetry have appeared in Poetry Review UK, the Massachusetts Review, Beloit Poetry Journal, Michigan Quarterly Review, Harvard Divinity Bulletin, and other journals. Her poetry collection, Quantum Heresies, won the 2019 Kithara Book Prize. Angelus News said of her debut collection that it feels written in that vein of a poet-scientist or a scientist-poet. There is more wonder here than certainty, more faith than doubt. This is not to say that doubt doesn't serve a particular purpose of giving the poet reason to look at, to conjecture about, and to document the world around her. Each poem in the collection is infused with a sense of mysticism, resulting, I love this, in a book that effectively weds the scientific with the spiritual. Mary Peelen, who says, I also believe there's room for everyone in this poetry community, and supporting the poets we know and love not only lifts their boats, but it buoys our own work too. And that her favorite poets change every day. Nicky Beer is the author of The Octopus Game and The Diminishing House, both winners of the Colorado Book Award for Poetry. Her poems have been published in Alaska Quarterly Review, The Best American Poetry, The Nation, The New Yorker, Southern Review, Kenron Review, and elsewhere. Camille Dungy, the poetry editor of Orion, who has been featured in this series, had this to say about The Octopus Game. I can't help but succumb to the enamored oceanic maw of these poems. I love their horror and humility, their playfulness, implicating me in the mysterious beauty of the universe. Nicky Beer connects the reader to the octopus, connects the octopus to the reader, and connects us all to her poem's surprising subjects. Drawing insight from least predictable places, these poems are a lesson in how ardor ignites not in unlikeness, but unlikelihood. Beer's awards also include a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts, a Ruth Lilly Fellowship from the Poetry Foundation, a MacDowell Colony Fellowship, a fellowship and a scholarship from the Breadloaf Writers Conference, a Mary Wood Fellowship from Washington College, a Discovery the Nation Award, and a Campbell Corner Prize. She's an associate professor of the University of Colorado, Denver, and she co-edits the journal Copper Nickel. She'd also really like a beer to be named after her, like Dr. Beer. Nicky Beer, who says, I grew up in a house where literature was valued. My parents were big readers. There were always books in the house, and they always read to me. When I was a kid, there was a promo for a special on PBS about tigers. The voiceover used an excerpt from the William Blake poem, The Tiger. Hearing that use of language, I knew it was something different. So without further ado, we'll begin with Alexandra. Welcome.
Thank you, Heather. Those were just the most beautiful introductions, and I am overjoyed to be reading with Mary and Nicky. This is such a wonderful lineup, and I am so honored. Thank you so much, Ron, for inviting me to read for Alaska Quarterly Review. It's a journal that I have loved for years and years and been thrilled to be published in several times, and this is just a joy. So I'm going to open with a few poems from my newest book, or what we'll call Desire. And this first one is called Sketch, Charcoal, and Body on Paper. The girls who posed for beginning drawing, insecurity slipped off their shoulders and draped over chairs, knew how to turn themselves into specimens, naked and safe as feathers or bones or the amphibrax of antlers, how to suggest like that wildness and bodies in excess of the bodies we could see. Their faces, when I passed them later in the hall, out of place, too intimate to look at. Afterthoughts of neck and breasts and hips, what I feared of my skin, its proportion, perspective, the way I was always and never really posing, how I wanted that beauty that knew how not to care, let people stare, let them mismeasure, smudge pages with charcoal, erase me. So this poem was published, this next one was published by Alaska Quarterly Review originally, and it's came out of an interdisciplinary arts project I was doing with the Basque Arts Collective, titled Play Like a Girl, that was investigating the insult or expression not to play like a girl. And in the process of thinking about this, I started thinking about a character named Ophelia, who I imagine as the feisty survivor version of the tragic Ophelia, and she appears throughout this book in various contemporary situations. So this is called Ophelia Plays Like a Girl, and again, thanks to AQR for first publishing it. Ophelia plays like a girl because no one tells her not to, not at first. Her hands like high desert clouds, more shadow than rain. She presses the piano's pedal to sustain herself inside her skin, flicker of tomboy on a barbed wire fence, pockets stuffed with bread for invisible horses, their hooves soft notes, dust storms swirling between the bars of music. Every good bird does, fly-spangled buzz of afternoon, empty washes between keys. Her mother in the kitchen, how the mixer sings like Mozart's starling. She read somewhere, he heard it in a pet store cage, whistling his piano concerto in G in perfect time. All cows eat grass. All music is caged inside some body, some motor, some dry wind, rattling the metal on the porch. What more can she be? Two hands scattering seeds. Chord of sunburned and lonely and learning girl with scorpions in the piano's strings. So this poem takes the character of Ophelia again and imagines her in a quite different setting, this time in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. So when I was doing research for this book, I spent a lot of time for other reasons looking at statues around New York, many of them allegorical figures represented by women. So figures like beauty and memory. And I started thinking about how similarly and how objectified all of these figures were represented. And so this imagines Ophelia going through the Metropolitan Museum looking for a statue of anger. It's called Ophelia Looks for Anger at the Metropolitan Museum. When she learned women can be anything, she didn't know they just meant allegory. Evening's one bare breast, sloping like moonlight towards her ribs, or beauty's dress, slipping past her nipples, skin smooth as sweet wine, the soft bloom of columbine when it used to mean a flower, or purity absconded from personality, that rustling hive of body, just winged marble soul now. It's terrifying, like the rapture or a taxidermied cat, all glazy eyes and curves hardened to hold meaning in. How not one will ever flinch or drop her thorn of vice or wear a sweatsuit with sweetie written on the ass to sleep alone. It's hard to argue specifics with a concept, but she wants to say, memory, set the fucking mirror down. Stop gazing all dreamy at how dreams and youth must fade. You're like a Barry Manilow song, each word headed for ruin, like that Dietrich movie where she played a model, but the censors censored all her posing, left the statues, cut blood and flesh and woman, song of songs. She's not a prude, but sometimes you can keep your clothes on, like in this atrium, air-conditioned so the art won't spoil. At least Cleopatra, with her handy asp, has attitude, a name you could name something living. Here Cleo, here kitten, here Nydia, blind flower girl of Pompeii. Everyone loves a good martyr. How resigned sorrow had banished her smile, but not her sweetness. How she's nobly groping through rubble, breasts exposed, to mean whatever a woman's body means after a volcano explodes and it's raining hot, invisible ash. So I'll close with two newer poems. This one is a few years old, but part of a series that I'm working on that look at language of American patriotic songs in relation to various contemporary situations, in this case, in part gun violence. And this draws on language from the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which when I was a child, for several years, I misheard, and I thought the line was not "mine eyes have seen the glory," but "my knives have seen the glory." So it opens with that. Mine eyes have seen the glory. Admitting I never stopped wanting the misheard line, my knives, those blades graced with handles and sight. About glory, who knew anything in kindergarten? At best, a plastic bucket of chlorine water dumped over my head, apocalyptic, I didn't know the word yet, and baptismal. Atheist child, this was the closest I would get. Pool tiles on cool Texas mornings, the swim teacher shocking us into submission, bravery, freedom, glory, whole countries of abstraction. I only saw with mine eyes, ringing, whinging, stinging water. I mean, with my body and its sudden blindness in the face of. About this country, who gets to dive and rise and who gets trampled like the vintage, I still can't see the justice at 43. Mad Men keep singing on TV. It's all an act. Those children never died for real. New mouths keep mouthing. We are praying for the victims' families. We are praying. This is freedom. We used to sing facing the flag like it could hear us. We used to sing His truth is marching. We once held ice cubes shaped like Texas in a Texas schoolroom where no one shot us. Just water dripping from our fingers. Glory, glory to the playground hippopotamus with its rusting springs we bounced on. Glory to the air a child leaves and then returns to. My knives have seen the pool head first, the concrete, the drain's dark suction, but then the bubbling back, sweet surface breaking. Hallelujah to the desks shaped like desks a child has no reason to dive beneath. the fiery gospels of cinnamon jolly ranchers, the trumpets of ice cream cones, then Texas melting down to clean our fingers. About naivete in 1980, we were all midair, headlong, this country heading where it's gone, as the saying goes, if we don't change direction. My jubilant feet above my head, with you my grace shall deal as I hit the pool water. Let us die, let us die, let us dive to make men free. We used to sing upside down. We used to face the flag like it could see us as we builded him an altar, as he sifted our hearts like playground sand into a bucket. We never asked what if he or he or he loosed the fateful lightning. There were sides straight as stripes on the flag. We were the future, said Whitney Houston. We were the world, said Michael Jackson. If our eyes got rusty, someone, glory, glory, would polish them, wouldn't they? Until we reflected stars. I've been writing about gun violence for over a decade and co-edited bullets into bells of poems about it. And I keep thinking it will become a subject that is not as timely in this country. And then every time I read that, there's just been another mass shooting. I'm going to try to be a little bit more optimistic for my final poem. There's optimism in facing the tragedy too, though, I do believe. But this last poem was actually commissioned by the Inlander in Spokane, which asked a group of writers to write something hopeful for the start of 2021. And I was having a hard time in late December coming up with anything that I was feeling very hopeful about. This was before the vaccine was really, or any of the vaccines were really being rolled out. And obviously it had been quite a dark year for many of us. And I was saved by reading an article about animals in space. So space spiders came to the rescue to restore some optimism. And the article by Elizabeth Dorer, which is called Laika the Dog and the First Animals in Space, provides the epigraph, which is 2 garden spiders named Arabella and Anita were used to study how orbiting Earth would impact spiders' ability to spin webs. Arabella spun a fairly symmetric web, even though the thread thickness varied, something that earthbound spiders don't experience. And reading this, I realized how much I felt like a space spider. So this is titled, When, Like Garden Spiders from Space Orbit, We Return. We will weave a web the size of the rose bush all over the rose bush, the way people throw their arms around relatives in airports as if they are trying to attach 1,000 thin silk threads of love plus gravity plus where have you been so long to their feet and shuffly suitcases and knit-capped heads. We will spin knit caps with tassels for everyone out of space dust and our own exhausted bodies. We will not talk about what it felt like to spin up there while we were also spinning. We will not say 8 eyes full of darkness or that long unanchored pulling, like trying to unwrap moonlight from its tight-wrapped spool of moon. So it's no wonder it wavered from us like arcane geometry, thinning and thickening, like we were seeing it from dimensions different than we'd ever thought of. We will say cucumber leaf, pumpkin with its unwinding tethered coils. We will launch from them dirtily, earthily. We will not ask what the point was. We will return like a radio transmission out of the desert when the song reattaches its filaments of breathy voice to music and the rasping of the wind is over, the rasping of space blanking past us. We will crawl back to what we love as if it is earth mist ordinary, as if we are not dizzy still, lank-legged. We will offer what we have always offered, out of everything, most days, fairly symmetric. We will look down, down into the leafy wet of spring or whatever this new season is. Thank you so much. And thank you again to Alaska Quarterly Review for having me as part of this great lineup. I can't wait to hear Mary and Nicky.
Oh, thank you, Alexandra. And yes, Mary is up next.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Heather, for that beautiful introduction. I appreciate that. And first of all, I just wanted to congratulate AQR on 40 years. It's really impressive. AQR is just consistently the most wonderful literary journal. And I'm so honored to be part of it, to have been published by AQR, and to be part of this reading series. And I want to give special thanks to Ron Spatz, who is my first editor. He published my very first poem, changed everything for me. And so I just really appreciate Ron as an editor who's published my work through the years. So I'm just really thrilled to be part of this. I'm going to start by reading a poem that's a pandemic poem. It's not usually, this isn't the kind of thing I usually write. Most of my work is inspired by science and math. But this year, I haven't written anything, hardly anything at all. I've just, because of the pandemic, because of family issues, a bunch of things, hardly anything at all. And so this is the only poem I've written in over a year. So it's about this time, but it's also very much about place. I'm in Paris right now. I'm reading to you from Paris, France, where I'm living now. But I was born and raised in Michigan. And this poem is about those two places. It's very much about place. And it's about water. It's called Blue. Walking up 5 flights in a spiral stairway in the Marais, I recall how water lifted me up when I was a girl back in Michigan, a state so great with lakes, my mother assured me there'd always be fresh water, tideless waves, an infinite series, a liquid eternity in Grand Haven where I floated all summer, sans curfew or fear of contagion. It's dark this fall in Paris. Cafes closed, COVID on the rise again. The cloud ceiling hovers gray and damp. The tap water is chalky with calcium. Down in the street, Rue Rambuteau, yellow vested citizens protest confinement, capitalism. God knows nothing is perfect. Not even this gilded city where the church stone is heavy as news from home. I'm blue, yes, but even I have to admit Parisian light is a full-on cliche and a sky low enough to suggest reachable perfection. Heaven isn't an actual place, but sometimes when an impulse fires azure through my optic nerve, I can feel it. Or when at the end of a long and troubled poem, a barbed thrill catches me in the chest, a fishhook in the jaw of a bluegill, panicked, flapping, slick, pulled from Gull Lake for breakfast. There are cities in Michigan with no drinkable water. My nerves carry this thirst forward in time the way gravitational waves convey suns and planets through outer space. Tonight, the great blue dome over Paris is torn open just far enough to let the moon and Mars shine through. The stars are pure theory, dispersing at light speed along with the universe. So the rest of the poems I'm going to read are from my book. It's called Quantum Heresies. Came out almost 2 years ago. The first poem I'm going to read from this is called Supernova. And when I was working on this poem, I was thinking about Sylvia Plath, who's one of my favorite poets. And it occurred to me that what everyone knows about her, whether they know anything about poetry or not, is that she committed suicide. I thought that, it's kind of too bad, but okay, that's what everyone knows about her. And similarly, I thought a supernova, which is, of course, the death of a star, it's all we know about it is its death, not its light. And like Sylvia Plath, maybe we don't all know about her art. So those are the sorts of things I was thinking about when I wrote this poem. It's called Supernova. Dying is an art, said Sylvia Plath. Dark energy providing the opposite of gravity. A future sun will rise up in all its glory, so red and ravenous it devours the daytime sky. Matter ripping itself into sound and light in one last explosion, uncontainable as art itself. Heaven performs a billion spectacular finales. It's up to us to conjure the rest. We'd all start with divinity and work backwards if we could manage the math. But even Lady Lazarus burned her miraculous hair in the calculus of resurrection. Here at the table, event horizon flickering pink, we begin with the absolute. The Emperor of Ice Cream, Mrs. Ramsey's charm, and light, of course, the way it always travels at light speed. Everything else is contingency. Cutlery glinting like a phantom, peaches in a milk white bowl, figs going bloody blue. The next poem I'm reading is called Chaos Theory. Chaos theory is an interesting thing for me to read about. I always assumed it just meant that everything was chaotic, but it doesn't really mean that. Chaotic systems like the weather, for example, do take on patterns that are recognizable, but we can't predict them because we don't know all the starting points. And this is the famous butterfly effect. Butterfly waves its wings in Singapore. It's going to change the clouds in Paris. And that's really true. So I was thinking about those small things, how the small things at the beginning change everything. And so that's what I was thinking about when I wrote this piece. It's called Chaos Theory. Entangled in the electromagnetic field around a human heart, fate changes its shape recursively. I learned in childhood how destiny turns on tiny things. Cracks in the sidewalk, sticks and stones, apparitions fulfilling the promise of fundamental symmetry. It takes an eye for pattern to see the way the soothsayer sees. Or Mandelbrot, his fractal designs carving the limits of space. Galaxies twirl in a teacup. Animals run through pixelated clouds. New universes, like fictions, arise not out of emptiness, but how it's filled with gravestones and doxologies, ghost of Grandma P everywhere I look, exhorting me to trust in Jesus, lorem ipsum of my soul's erratic geometry. I mentioned Grandma P here. She's a character who recurs in my book. She's based on my real grandma, but she's kind of a ghost. And I have another piece where she shows up like a ghost. And this piece was first published in Alaska Quarterly Review. It's about gravity. Gravity is my favorite fundamental force. I love reading about it. And this piece is both about Newtonian gravity and Einsteinian gravity. So Newtonian with its formula, with the constant, G constant, the two masses multiplied, divided by the distance between them. Einstein gravity, it's about the shape of the universe. If a mass impacts the shape of the universe, then the other planets will fall toward it. Basic idea. So this is called the universal law. Gravity is the gift of shape, the downhill way we tend to roll. So when the bow begins to break, we know which way to go. Mass is variable, hard to gauge, but G is constant, a glimmering icon weighty as Grandma P calling down the Lord at bedtime, putting us all to shame. A body at rest remains at rest. It's a law of Newtonian motion. You can trust the math, so hush now and let yourself fall. Lay down your rockabye soul in the unbounded darkness where a billion stellar galaxies unwind their spiraled arms. Let's see. So the next poem I want to read is called X, and this was indeed the very first poem that I ever published, accepted by Ron Spatz for AQR. It's also the first poem in the book, and it was one of the first poems I ever really wrote, too. I actually went to graduate school to study fiction. I did an MFA in fiction. Sort of by mistake, started writing poetry while I was there, and I wrote this for a class. And it stuck. I really have been writing poetry ever since, particularly based on math. And this poem was the poem that gave me the idea to write a whole book on math and science. And so it's a very, very small poem, but for me, it has a lot inside it. It's called X. X obeys algebraic laws, but resists particularity. It's the placeholder of uncertainty, like the notion of God. A variable, a kiss, a chromosome. X signs legal documents in 2 concise strokes. It could be me, you, or the number of poppies we planted out back by the fence last Sunday. After so many days of rain, the afternoon was sunlit, translucent, perfect as an integer. So I'm going to conclude with a companion piece to that poem. And also chronologically, I wrote it last in this book, and it ended up being the last poem in the book. And I see these 2 poems as sort of bookends. Bookends. They literally are. This piece is called Variable. The X could have been anything at all. The sound of wind chimes, a gong, a choir, a cantor, a mermaid, a school marm, cathedral bells. Instead, what a lark. It's laughter. The man who sits in the park across the street has habits of hilarity, disciplined as a cleric. Ha! Exhaled in 8 pulses, stress on the 3rd and 5th. Never the slightest flux in rhythm, volume, or pitch. His breath orders the world into countable sets. Number expressed as a verb. It calls me back. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Mary. Oh, that was wonderful. Thank you very much. It was soothing and smart. And now we're going to go on to Nicky.
Hi, folks. I am so happy to be here. Heather, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And Ron, thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this reading. It's such an honor to be reading with Alexandra and Mary. And honestly, it's also just incredibly exciting to be here as an audience member listening to their extraordinary work. This is just, so fantastic to hear all this wonderful poetry today during National Poetry Month. I am so happy to be here in celebration and support of the Alaska Quarterly Review. And I just want to express my gratitude that this amazing journal exists and has been such a legendary presence in the literary community for so long. And I am so proud that my work has appeared in its pages. I am going to be reading poems to you now from my, my upcoming book. It's going to be coming out next spring, Milkweed Editions. And the book is called Real Phonies and Genuine Fakes. And I thought I'd start off by reading a poem about magicians. And this poem is based on Jim Steinmeier's book, Hiding the Elephant, How Magicians Invented the Impossible and Learned to Disappear. So, the magicians at work. Over the years, they hunted, the wayward apprentice watchmakers, the disappointing sons who transformed their surnames, hunted over acres of hinges, cogs, calluses, hidden whiskey, mustaches, a breath from Farrell, poured an ocean of fortune into fabrications of brass and iron, spent entire seasons strumming massive harps of wire into perfect calibrations of invisibility, prayed to the gods of adjustable mirrors, cursed the gods of temperamental gaslights, broke the legs of imitators and thieves, chewed holes in each other's pockets, harnessed nightmares of giant silver hoops, making endless passes over the bodies of the dead, hoisted high a cenotaph for hundreds of sacrificed rabbits, breathed miles of delicate thread into the lost labyrinth of their lungs, all to make a woman float, and none of them ever thought of simply asking her. This next poem I'm going to read was published in the AQR, and part of the poems in this book, in these poems, a lot of them I'm trying to write more directly just about my own experiences, my own struggles with mental illness. And so, this is an important poem to me in that respect, and so proud that it was an AQR. The poem is inspired in part by Fernando Botero's painting, Melancholy, and this is Etymology. Etymology. Those were the days when I didn't want to kill myself, but I did take the word suicide out of my pocket now and then, its syllables like the undulations of black and orange-furred caterpillars, revolting and adorable. Sometimes the word would grow tender rows of quills that I could stroke and pluck into a private music. Even the abysmal eyes of horses watching me as I walked through their country of flies could not silence it. I was the man in his dead mother's summer dress, preening over one shoulder in a hand mirror, admiring how his dark hair foamed at the décolletage, waiting for the annihilating footstep on the stair. Next poem is for all the romantics out there. Small Claims Courtship. I took the 27 bones from my left hand and made a xylophone on which to play you love songs. I dragged a wheelbarrow of sugar backwards over the parking lot so the ants could spell out your name. In your honor, I placed a respectable second in the county fair's eel eating contest. After my long-term letter writing campaign, Uruguay has agreed to reclassify you as its national fern. That easily blackmailed cosmonaut will be whispering blessings upon you when she faces Jupiter. A kindergarten in Duluth dreams only of your smile at nap time. I'd rather not say how or why. I've tuned the grackles to the key of your favorite jingle, not perfectly, no. The world still fights me a little. Let's not even mention the angle of that cloud. I name my right shoe Twitter-pated and my left shoe hopeless before I circle your mailbox each night. My exhale is symptom and my inhale is remedy. This next poem is based on a really fantastic book by Melissa Milgram. It's a nonfiction book called Still Life: Adventures in Taxidermy. The poem begins with an epigraph from the World Taxidermy Championships rulebook book about a specific category of taxidermy called recreations. So here's the quote. Recreations are defined as renderings which include no natural parts of the animal portrayed. For instance, a recreation eagle could be constructed using turkey feathers, or a cowhide could be used to simulate African game. There's a poet mentioned in the poem, and the poet in question is Marianne Moore. And this is called Mating Call of the Recreation Panda. Cleanliness is my only real fault. I could have done with a little faux shit yellowing my rump, something to make it seem like the bamboo I'm chewing will end up somewhere. I bear the bodies of 17 grizzlies on my back alone, peeled, dried, clairol dyed and quilted into the whole of me. I know that my ears were done with great tenderness, and one quiet evening, my maker even briefly held one in his mouth. That I have no memory is hardly his fault. I'm not even a ghost, since this requires both life and death as precedent. Says the poet, what is more precise than precision? Illusion. I am more precise than the clockwork of your own expiring mitochondria. Come closer. Try to guess the provenance of my claws. Gently blow the dust from the smoked snifters of my eyes. Imagine from what or whom your own body could be collaged, whose lips could be stitched into an homage of your smile. Take my lie in your arms. This next poem is about Bruce Wayne, for whom I have some choice words. Dear Bruce Wayne, my parents are dead too. A dirty, self-cannibalizing Gotham. I also claim it, its city limits built by my skin. I slough and slough, but the city remains. Tell me, if you'd watched your mother's face go a slow yellow after they cut off her breast, if you'd watched your father's mind get chewed down to spasms, who would you fight then? What broken string of pearls would you chase into the gutter? Lucky boy to have an enemy. Admit it. What bugs you the most about the Joker is his drag. You suspect his crayoned mouth a lampoon of your dead mother. But don't you crave sometimes to be a little tacky? Doesn't the all-black bore after a while? Even your sweet ride can't help but leave a little fart of flames in its wake. How many others glare from the shadows in a one-man parade in a loud costume, blowing glitter kisses at grim justice? You just think you want to kill him for better reasons. What kind of person would trade laughter for righteousness? Every woman goes out knowing what you think you alone had sussed. The world is a dark alley hiding a gun in its mouth. It has more than enough reasons to make you cover your face. The moon waxes, the bruise wanes. Every woman is Batman. This is a second to last poem warning. And this poem is called Because My Grief Was a Tree. Because my grief was a tree, it forgave the dog that pissed on it. It moderated quarrels between the stones. It had a few knots that looked like a weeping face. It had a few knots that looked like a laughing face. It never stopped grasping the earth. It was badly tuned by the wind. It grew inedible fruit. It grew fruit that fed the worms magnificently. It held a yellow newspaper on its head for 7 months. It felt the rumba in a squirrel's chest pressing against it. It wore a gash from when my friend was drunk and stupid. It looked up at the geese in their lofty arrows. It looked up at the geese in their trombone-heavy operettas. It looked up at the geese and wished them all good shoes. It stretched its arms wider every year. It waved its dozens of dark hats over the grass. For this next poem, my last poem rather, this is there's a brief moment where the speaker has a dialogue with God about 2/3 of the way through, and God answers back. So I'll try to indicate that with my voice as much as I can. I'm sure you'll recognize the voice of God when you hear it. And this is a poem. I always worry that I'm gonna get kicked out of the poetry club because of this poem's title. But you know, what are you gonna do? I gotta be me. So this is The Poet Who Does Not Believe in Ghosts. The poet who does not believe in ghosts walks through the darkened house and knows she is alone. The groans in the pipes are not secret communiques meant for her deciphering. The gnashing of the floorboards is just old wood badly joined. There is no century-old vengeance reaching out from mirrors, no floating ethereal feet advancing over the bedroom's threshold. The branch tapping against the window is a branch tapping against the window. It is not that she has no fear or that she is stubbornly logical. She believes death is God's apology for suffering, a promise that the deepest human pain will never be eternal. The sudden cataclysms of the brain, the helplessness of search parties, children savaged, watching one's beloved go mad, the slow betrayal of the body. It is death and not the rainbow that is God's covenant with mankind. So you won't set us back upon the earth afterwards, transparent and helpless, singing out our griefs as we move empty chairs about in empty rooms? No, I would never. So let her make her unpoetic way through cobwebs and past unsettled curtains. Let her be content that her mother, her father, are not disturbing the genealogies of attic dust. The friends she's outlived are not circulating damp manifestos in the basement's shadows. They do not need her to solve anything, are not writing her letters to which she owes replies. Let her be content that she is completely unnecessary to her beloved dead. Thank you again so much.
Oh, wow. Thank all of you very much. And we have, I don't know, some time here, 5, 6, 7 minutes, but I'm not counting. By watching all of your reactions, I would just love to hear if you all have any questions for each other or comments or want to discuss at all what you've heard, because I was just intrigued by all the overlap, and I was watching all of you going, and I'd love to hear what you're thinking.
I just wanted to express, Mary, I was so excited when you were introducing your Sylvia Plath poem, because I think it is a shame that her suicide has sort of come to define her, so to speak. And I always I get frustrated that not enough people know that she was really funny, and, and that, the truth of her suicide and the truth that she was also like a very funny person and she was a funny poet. That those truths can exist. And it was just very exciting for me also for you to be sort of discussing the cosmological in the context of Plath as well. So it really wasn't so much a question and so much as to say, yes, I love that. That was so exciting. And Alexandra, the poem where you have Ophelia walking through the Metropolitan Museum of Art, that's just another sweet spot for me. I love ekphrastic poetry in general, but I love ekphrastic poetry also that looks at the spaces of museums themselves, because that's often part of our experience of receiving art as well. It can really affect how we read it. And sometimes there are ekphrastic poems where we've kind of edited out everything around us when we look at art. And so it was incredibly exciting on top of that to also have your Ophelia character in that context as well. So again, I'm just expressing excitement, but I just wanted to do so, basically, that's all.
Yeah, I really found it exciting to hear you both too. Can you hear me? Do I have my thing on? I guess I do. Yeah, I've read both of your poetry before. It was amazing to hear it in your voice, in your own voices. It added so much to it. That's why it's just so amazing to have a series like this, because I can read. I think I've read all of your books from both of you. And it added so much dimension to hear you say it, to hear you recite it. And I just felt like I found so much more, I found more depth in it, various personalities within each poem. I loved, Nicky, especially the way you read the last one. with the multiple voices, voice of God, voice of the speaker. That's amazing to me. Being able to do that, I think, is some kind of witchery. Same with Ophelia, same thing. I felt like there was this, it was like a voice of God, or, Dux ex machina, speaking through you, through these poems. And that's an amazing thing. Beautiful, beautiful work. Thank you.
Likewise, I just absolutely loved hearing both of you. And I love everything that you just said, Mary. And I think there's some kind of witchery in doing what you do in terms of taking these gigantic questions of the universe and scientific and mathematical concepts and being able to make them into things that I both feel as though I get more insight into what those concepts are, but they are completely inhabited and of the sort of world that I ordinarily live in and think about as well. And that's just such a beautiful gift to be able to do that. And Nicky, I love what you said about Mary's poem about Plath, because I think that you do that so amazingly in your work, is hold the space for humor. Your poems are just, I don't know if you could see how much I was laughing during your poems, but they're taking on such incredibly serious subjects, but with just those amazing angles on them. That taxidermy poem is just incredible. And as a poet who, of course, does write about ghosts, I don't know fully how much I believe, but who does write about ghosts, I also just love the sentiment of the final poem as well. So this was a complete joy to hear both of you.
Well, thank you all so much. And I guess, sometimes we ask, do you have any advice to poets, to future poets and writers? But I'm thinking with all of you, if maybe, especially because this is National Poetry Month, if you have any advice for people who are reading poetry, what to look for, what some sort of advice for someone who's a reader of poetry, or even a reader of your poems, that would help us all appreciate them more. Of course, you don't have to answer that if you don't want to. I don't want to put you all on the spot, but I'm just curious.
Well, it could seem an obvious thing, but I find, especially when I'm having trouble entering poetry, to read it out loud. In hearing both of you read tonight, seriously, it added so much more depth to what I thought I already understood. And I find that I can do that with my own voice. Reading poetry out loud, for me, I think most poetry is meant to be read, meant to be heard. And a different sense of meaning, rhythms you hear, the sounds of words, the way they go together, you can elide over that if you're reading it to yourself. And to me, that has a lot to do with what the poetry is, what it sounds like out loud. But it also just can make more sense. I think that some people are intimidated by poetry, and I always say to them, read it out loud. Let's see what it sounds like. And suddenly it makes more sense to everyone. So that's the one thing I would say.
I was going to say the exact same thing. And I make my students attend readings for that reason. And I keep telling them right now, I know some of them said they were going to come to this reading actually, but I keep telling them that it's just an incredibly different experience to get to hear the poet themselves read their work. And that's such a way to engage. And poetry from its earliest origins was a spoken art, as well as, before it was something that was written on the page, and then always alongside that as well. So I think that's so essential. And the other thing that I tell people who don't feel as though they have a way into poetry is just to expose themselves to a really wide range of it. That there's so many different types of poems out there. Jericho Brown, I heard in a reading a year or so ago, say that poetry is like, that he always tells people that poetry is like trees, that you may take them for granted on your daily walk or something, but if all the trees one day disappeared, you would really notice it. And that poetry is just kind of in the atmosphere in all kinds of ways that we may not think about or take for granted most of the time. And just, I tell people that, poetry is not one thing that exists on the page or in an academic space. It can be all of these different forms, and to keep looking for what they find that they love.
I have to third Mary and Alexandra's recommendations about reading poetry out loud, because you can, register its presence in such a bodily way by doing that, and you're getting back to its origins with song. And I think also hearing poetry read out loud is crucial as well. And the fact that we live in such an age right now where we can attend readings online. There are so many recordings and videos of poets reading their work out loud that we just have never had access to, like, for the entire history of literature. It's amazing, and it's incredibly empowering to think that, even if you were isolated somewhere, either, logistically, that you're living in an isolated area, or if you're somehow just personally isolated from others, that there's still this way that you can have this connection with this extraordinary art made by other human beings that can just make you feel alive and that can make you feel less lonely. Yeah, that's what I have to say.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Nicky, Dr. Beer, Mary, and Alexandra. It's been a pleasure spending an hour with you, and thank you very much for your support of Alaska Quarterly Review. And also, thank you for joining us today for AQR's 40th anniversary literary series. And on behalf of the Center for the Narrative and Lyric Arts, all of our gratitude for the generosity of today's poets, and also to Alex Tate, Cody Carver, and the staff at the Anchorage Museum at Rasmussen Center who produced this program. Remember, you can access it on YouTube or at our website. And for those of you that haven't, please consider making a donation to Alaska Quarterly Review so that we can continue another 40 years and help support poets like the ones you've just heard, and get poetry out there and help us to reach our modest fundraising goal. And Ron, the last words, as always, are yours.
Yeah, thank you, Heather. I want to thank you. This is your 19th event that you've volunteered your Sundays for, and you're fabulous. And not only that, you're a terrific writer in your own right. So very grateful to you. And to our three readers, Nicky and Mary and Alexandra. Wow. So it'll be up on YouTube, and get people to look at it, because why? Because it's always good for them to hear you read. And we will have, by the end of this series, more than 60 individuals and much more in the way of special videos that poets, fiction writers, and essayists will love. So we're really building up our YouTube channel as a way to support our writers and the literary community. So next week, we're going to have our final event of Alaska Poetry Month, Sunday, April 25, with a quartet of terrific poets: Virginia Conchin, Elise Knorr, Kate Partridge, and Heather Tressler. And that'll conclude the regular part of our series. And then we're going to conclude the series itself on May 2nd with what we're calling our CODA event. And I titled it Literary Milestones to Cornerstones, which means that 40 years is a milestone, but that's looking down and backwards. And so we need to build off of it. And so there'll be two readings by emerging writers, poets, the poet Danusha Lamiris and short story writer Menini Nayar will do readings, and then they will join a panel that will be chaired by Anchorage Museum CEO Julie Decker and myself. And we will also have acclaimed essayist Danielle Offrey. She's the co-founding editor of the Bellevue Literary Review, which I'm a fan of. And they're celebrating this year their 20th anniversary. And they also published one of the readers. And I thought that was a good way to connect the two editors with this event. And Danielle also has some very special perspectives as an internist and a deeply knowledgeable medical person, as well as editor and writer, about the pandemic. So that CODA should be very interesting on May 2nd. So with that, I want to thank everyone who's joined us today. It's a pleasure to do these what an honor to work with writers and poets. And tonight, with Nicky, Mary, and Alexandra. And I find myself kind of levitated a little bit at the end of these things. Luckily, it's not really late at night as it is for you, Mary, there in France, because now it's 2 o'clock in the morning. We started at 1. So I don't think you want to be levitating that late. So I look forward to everybody joining us next week, Sunday, same time. So thank you, everyone, and have a great evening or night or morning or afternoon, as it's the case in Alaska. So thank you, everybody, and goodbye for now.
Thank you, Ron.